What would you do if the HOA knocked on your door? I took a stand. And here's what happened. It was a regular morning. Or so I thought. The sun was barely peeking through the blinds as I shuffled into the kitchen, bleary-eyed from a restless night of sleep. I was still groggy, making my usual cup of coffee, unaware that this seemingly ordinary day would soon turn into something far from typical. I had no idea that I would soon be facing an unexpected confrontation that would rattle me to my core and make me question just how far people would go to impose their authority. As I sipped my coffee, the peace of the morning was abruptly shattered by a knock at the door. I paused, uncertain whether I'd imagined it or if I was just still half asleep. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent, as if whoever was on the other side had no intention of being ignored. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Who could it be this early? I glanced at the clock. It was barely 8 a.m. Most of my neighbors were still in bed, especially on a weekend. The only visitors I typically had this early were either the occasional delivery drivers or, perhaps, a stray package. I wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, this time with an urgency that made me uneasy. I set my coffee mug down on the counter, wiped the sleep from my eyes, and made my way to the door. I opened it cautiously, half expecting to see a familiar face, maybe even someone from the neighborhood. What I didn't expect to see were two people standing there in business attire, holding a clipboard and wearing expressions that struck me as a little too formal for a simple neighborly visit. Both of them were well-dressed, crisp suits, and they wore stern faces, almost as if they were part of some official delegation. One of them, a middle-aged man with glasses, greeted me first. "Good morning. We're here from the Homeowners Association. We need to discuss some issues regarding your property." At the sound of the words, Homeowners Association, my heart sank, but I did my best to remain composed. I had heard the rumors of how the HOA could be overbearing, controlling, and downright intrusive, but I had never personally experienced it. I lived outside their jurisdiction, or so I thought, but here they were, standing on my doorstep like they owned the place. The man continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to conduct an inspection of your property. As part of a routine check, there have been complaints, and we need to ensure that everything is up to code. May we come in?" I stood there, dumbfounded for a moment. My mind raced. "What complaints? I am not part of the HOA," I said, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't even belong to your association." The woman standing next to the man, a tall, sharply dressed woman with short black hair, seemed to glance at her colleague as if unsure of how to respond. There was an awkward pause. They both seemed a little taken aback, as if they hadn't expected such a direct response. "We're aware that your property falls under our jurisdiction," the man said, trying to assert his authority. "We've received reports of violations in your area. It's just a standard procedure. Nothing to worry about." I stared at them, unable to believe what I was hearing. I had lived in this house for years, and I knew that my land wasn't part of their association's control. In fact, when I had first purchased the property, I made sure to check ensuring that the land was outside the HOA's reach. I didn't want to deal with the invasive rules and regulations that so many of my neighbors complained about. The HOA was infamous in the area for its strict enforcement of rules that, frankly, seemed more like petty control than anything that benefited the community. So when I bought this property, I made sure it was far enough outside their jurisdiction to avoid their overbearing influence. Yet here they were, standing at my door, acting as though they had every right to inspect my land. The man continued speaking, but I could barely hear him over the pounding of my heart in my ears. "We understand this might be a bit of an inconvenience, but we just need a quick inspection. It'll only take a few minutes, and then we'll be on our way." I couldn't believe what was happening. The audacity of it all. The nerve of these strangers showing up at my doorstep, trying to enter my home without permission, demanding access to my property. I had dealt with pushy salespeople before, even had a few unannounced visitors at my door. But this was different. This was an outright invasion of my privacy, and it was happening right in front of me. I crossed my arms and looked at them both. "No," I said firmly. I am not letting you on my property. I don't know where you got your information from, but you've got the wrong person. I am not in your association, and I have no interest in complying with any inspection. I felt my pulse quicken as I stood my ground, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and the man's face became more rigid, as if he wasn't used to being challenged. We were just doing our job, he said, his voice tinged with a hint of condescension. You may not realize this, but your property is actually within our purview. We've had multiple reports, and now we were here to inspect. I could feel my anger rising as I listened to them speak. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. They were clearly trying to manipulate the situation, using their position to intimidate me. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I had nothing to fear. I knew the truth. I knew my rights, and I wasn't about to let them walk all over me just because they thought they could. I am sorry, but you were mistaken, I said, my voice gaining strength. I am not a member of your HOA. I have the paperwork to prove it. I turned to walk back inside, but then I stopped. Something told me I wasn't done yet. I needed to set this straight, once and for all. I turned back toward them. If you were going to insist on this inspection, you'll need to provide legal documentation proving that you have the right to be here. Otherwise, you were trespassing. The woman blinked in surprise, as if she hadn't anticipated such a direct challenge. The man's expression hardened, and for a moment, I thought he might get angry. But instead, they both stepped back, muttering something about needing to check their records before leaving. I could see the frustration in their eyes, the realization that they had been caught in a lie. But before they left, the man gave me a final, pointed look. We'll be back, he said, his voice colder than before. Don't you think this is over? I closed the door behind them with a sense of finality, my heart still pounding in my chest. I was shaken, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. I had stood up to them, proven that I wasn't going to let them trample over my rights. But I knew this wasn't the end. If the HOA officers were willing to show up unannounced and make such outrageous demands, there was more to this story. And whatever came next, I was ready for it. The moment I closed the door on the HOA officers, a wave of anger and frustration washed over me. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily as the adrenaline from the confrontation surged through me. How dare they show up at my door uninvited, trying to dictate terms and intimidate me? It was one thing to deal with pushy salespeople or unexpected guests, but this was different. This was a blatant attempt to encroach on my personal space, my land, and my life. I wasn't just going to let that slide. I knew the next steps were crucial. The HOA wasn't the kind of organization you could just brush off easily. They were notorious for their persistence, their desire to control, and their willingness to go to great lengths to get what they wanted. But what they didn't understand was that I wasn't just some random homeowner. I was fully aware of my rights, and I had done my homework when it came to the land I owned. I had deliberately chosen to live outside their jurisdiction, and I wasn't about to let anyone, including them, tell me otherwise. My first instinct was to calm down and take stock of the situation. I knew that I had every right to refuse them access to my property. The law was on my side. I didn't need to be a lawyer to understand that. My land, my house, my rules. But that didn't mean I could simply ignore them or assume they would back off on their own. I had to be smart about how I handled this. I needed to be firm but not aggressive, rational but not apologetic. It wasn't just about standing up for myself, it was about asserting my authority in a way that left no room for doubt. I started by going to my filing cabinet and pulling out the paperwork related to my property. I had all the legal documents ready: the deed, the land survey, the title confirmation, all of which clearly stated that my property was outside the boundaries of the HOA's control. There was no ambiguity. I had seen this kind of thing before. Heard the stories of HOA officers trying to pull people into their web with false claims of jurisdiction. But I wasn't going to be one of those people. I wasn't going to fall for their tricks. The papers were laid out neatly on the kitchen table as I took a deep breath and began reviewing them one more time, making sure I had everything in order, everything checked out. I was solid in my understanding of the property's boundaries. As I went over the documents again, a sense of calm started to replace the anger that had been bubbling inside me. I wasn't just acting out of frustration. I was in control of the situation, and that was a powerful feeling. Still, I knew that this wasn't over. The HOA wouldn't just give up because I closed the door on them. I had a feeling they would come back. Perhaps with more force. Perhaps with a more determined attitude. But I was ready for them. I wasn't just going to let them bully me into submission. This wasn't just about this one confrontation. It was about standing my ground and protecting my property and rights from any further encroachment. I wasn't the kind of person who let things go easily, especially when it came to my home. I spent the next few hours carefully preparing my defense, just in case they did return. I made a few phone calls to a local real estate attorney who specialized in property law. I wasn't sure I'd need to take it that far, but I wanted to be prepared. If the HOA came back with more aggression, I wanted to know exactly where I stood legally. After a quick consultation, the attorney reassured me that the documents I had were more than sufficient to prove my case, and I didn't need to worry about them having any legitimate claim over my property. Once that was settled, I turned my attention to how I would respond should they show up again. I wasn't going to open the door without knowing exactly what they had in mind, especially if they came with an even bolder demand for entry. I knew that the best course of action was to remain calm, to show them that I wasn't easily intimidated. But more than that, I wanted them to understand that I wasn't just a homeowner. They couldn't simply push me around. I was a person with legal rights, and I wasn't afraid to stand up for them. As I mulled over the situation, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of disbelief and indignation. How had this situation escalated so quickly? How had they been so bold as to show up at my door, demand access to my land, and act as though they were entitled to it? I had read the stories online about homeowners dealing with the relentless demands of HOA boards, those who were forced to comply with arbitrary rules, fined for minor infractions, and constantly harassed by board members who seemed to take pleasure in enforcing rules with an iron fist. But I hadn't ever imagined that I would be caught in the middle of such a confrontation myself. It was surreal. I began to think about how I could protect myself in the future. I couldn't just assume that this would be a one-time issue. The HOA was persistent, and if they felt they had any chance of getting control over my property, they would find a way to push it. So I began to think about what steps I could take to solidify my position. I considered installing security cameras, especially near the entrances to my property. It was becoming clear that I wasn't just dealing with well-meaning officials trying to enforce the rules for the greater good. I was dealing with an organization that had its own agenda, one that didn't respect boundaries or personal rights. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my property, I was fighting for my right to live my life without interference. I didn't ask for much. All I wanted was peace, quiet, and the ability to enjoy my home without constant surveillance or oversight. That's when the gravity of the situation really hit me. The HOA wasn't just a nuisance. It was a symbol of the constant battle for personal freedom in the face of a system that wanted to control every aspect of your life. I wasn't just resisting their intrusion, I was standing up for the principle of autonomy, for the right to make decisions for myself and my property without fear of retribution. As the day wore on, I realized that this situation wasn't just about fighting back, it was about setting a precedent. If I let the HOA walk all over me now, what would stop them from coming back again and again, chipping away at my rights piece by piece? If I didn't stand up for myself now, I would be giving them the green light to continue their invasive behavior in the future. I had to set boundaries clear, unambiguous boundaries that left no room for interpretation. By the time the evening came, I was exhausted but resolute. I had prepared myself for the next step, and I knew that if the HOA returned, I would be ready for them. The ball was in their court now. They could try to challenge me, but they would soon realize that I wasn't someone they could intimidate or control. I had my rights, my paperwork, and my determination to defend them. If they wanted to test me, they would soon find out that I wasn't someone who would back down easily. The night fell, and as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just entered into a battle that would test not just my patience but my resolve. But I was ready. I had everything I needed to stand my ground, and I wasn't going to let anyone push me around. This was my property, my rights, and no one, not even the HOA, was going to take that from me. The confrontation with the HOA officers had left me feeling shaken, yet strangely empowered. I had stood firm at the door, asserting my rights and refusing them entry. But despite that initial victory, I knew the battle wasn't over. I could feel the tension in the air. It hung like a thick fog around me, a sense that this wasn't the last IDC of the HOA. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that they would return at some point with more determination. Perhaps even with a legal team or some sort of documentation that could force me into compliance. It wasn't enough to simply send them away once. I needed to make it clear that I was not someone they could manipulate or intimidate. They had to understand, once and for all, that I was not under their jurisdiction. The idea of them returning and trying to bully me into compliance was more than unsettling, it was infuriating. I had worked too hard to create a space for myself, a sanctuary where I could live my life without interference. And I wasn't about to let some overzealous HOA officers come in and take that away from me. As I sat in my living room, staring at the empty space before me, I made a decision. I was going to prove, unequivocally, that my property was not under their control. I wasn't just going to stand my ground, I was going to strike back, armed with the facts and the documents that would end this debacle once and for all. It was time to gather all my legal paperwork. I had all the documents I needed, but I didn't just want to rely on my memory. I needed to be precise. Every detail had to be crystal clear. I headed to the filing cabinet, pulled open the drawer, and began going through the stack of documents I had kept safe since I first bought the property. The deed to the land, the title insurance documents, the survey showing the boundaries of my land, all of these were right where I had left them. But as I rifled through the papers, I realized there was something even more important that I needed. A clear explanation of the boundaries, in terms that even the HOA could not ignore. I needed something foolproof. Something that could make it absolutely impossible for them to argue or claim they had any authority over my property. I picked up the phone and called my real estate attorney, explaining the situation. I needed to know what to do if the HOA officers returned, and how I could prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that my property was not part of their domain. My attorney was quick to reassure me. "You've done everything right," she said. "You own the land outright, and the HOA has no jurisdiction. They can simply claim control over it because they feel like it. What you need to do is get a copy of the official property map, along with any other legal documents that show the boundaries. You need to have this prepared, so when they return, you can show them exactly where the line is drawn." With my attorney's guidance, I made a plan. I would obtain the official property map, and I would bring it to the HOA officers the next time they showed up. But I knew that they might not back down easily. They might try to intimidate me further, to push me into a corner where I would have no choice but to comply. So I had to be ready, not just with documents, but with an attitude of absolute certainty. I was not just a homeowner. I was a person who had the law on my side, and I had every right to defend myself. The next morning, I went to the county office to request a certified copy of the property map. The process was straightforward, but as I stood in line, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. I had done my homework. I had the facts, but I still wondered how far the HOA was willing to go. Were they truly this committed to controlling my property? Or was this just a misunderstanding? Either way, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I needed to make it clear to them that I wasn't someone who could be pushed around. When I walked out of that office, map in hand, I felt a small sense of victory. This was more than just a piece of paper, it was the concrete evidence that would prove my point. But as I headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that they might still come back, that the HOA would find some way to continue their pursuit of control. I spent the next few days preparing for the worst, double-checking the documents, and making sure everything was in order. I also took the time to review the neighborhood's bylaws, to ensure I hadn't missed anything. But I had done my research thoroughly, and I knew I had done everything right. My property was not under their control, and I had the paperwork to prove it. It wasn't too long before the inevitable happened. The HOA officers returned. This time, they didn't just knock at my door. They sent a letter in advance, stating that they would be conducting a final inspection of my property to ensure that it was compliant with their rules. The tone of the letter was more official, more commanding, and it made it clear that they were not backing down. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as I read through the letter. They were persistent, and I knew this would not be the last time they tried to intimidate me. But I wasn't worried. I was ready for them. I had the property map, the deed, and everything I needed to show that they had no right to be on my land. I was no longer going to be intimidated. I wasn't going to let them force their way in. When the officers arrived at my door once more, I was prepared. I didn't just open the door, I opened it with confidence. I greeted them coolly but firmly, and I handed them the certified property map, along with the other documents I had gathered. I could see the confusion in their eyes as they looked over the map. They hadn't expected this. They had come prepared to intimidate, to exert their control. But they hadn't counted on me being just as prepared as they were. I stood there, arms crossed, watching them as they examined the documents. The man from the first visit, the one who had seemed so sure of himself, now looked uncertain. He turned to the woman standing beside him and said something in a low voice. After what felt like an eternity, the man cleared his throat and looked at me. "It seems there has been some confusion," he said, his voice lacking the earlier confidence. "It appears your property is indeed outside our jurisdiction." We weren't aware of this. There was an awkward pause, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. "I thought so," I said, my voice steady. "I've been telling you all along. You've had the wrong person. And now, you can see that for yourselves." They apologized, awkwardly, and began to leave. As they walked away from my property, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and triumph. This was more than just about protecting my land, it was about proving that I wasn't going to let anyone push me around. I wasn't going to back down, no matter how much they tried to bully me. They thought they could come in and impose their rules, but I had shown them, with the law on my side, that I was in control. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA or felt powerless in the face of a system that tried to control every aspect of their lives. I had stood up for my rights, and in doing so, I had shown them that I wouldn't let anyone take what was rightfully mine. The HOA officers' sudden retreat left a strange silence hanging in the air. When I wasn't used to after a confrontation, it was as if a storm had passed through. But the sky was still heavy with the potential for another downpour. I had successfully proven my point and demonstrated that my property was outside of their jurisdiction. But that didn't mean I was completely off the hook. I knew they wouldn't simply let it go after all. This was a group that thrived on control, on dictating how people should live and manage their properties. The thought that they would just walk away quietly didn't sit well with me. There was still a lingering sense that they might return, possibly with a more formidable approach, or that they would attempt to twist the truth to make it seem like they were in the right. The next few days passed uneventfully. No knock on the door, no follow-up letters, no signs that the HOA officers had any intention of returning. I allowed myself to breathe easy for a while. But then, one afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was thick and official-looking, stamped with the HOA's insignia, and I could feel my stomach tighten as I tore it open. Inside was a letter from the HOA board, and as I read through it, my sense of unease began to grow. The letter was not an apology, as I had hoped. Instead, it was a carefully crafted attempt to manipulate the situation. The board claimed that there had been miscommunication, and that the previous officers who visited my property had been misinformed about the boundaries of my land. They insinuated that there had been an administrative error, and that the officers were simply doing their jobs when they visited my home. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that I had been correct all along, no recognition that I had shown them with the correct documentation. that my property wasn't under their jurisdiction. The letter went on to state that the HOA was still committed to ensuring that all properties in the community are in compliance with HOA guidelines, and that while they were now aware that my property was not technically under their purview, they would continue to monitor the situation. They even went so far as to say that further inspections might be warranted if they received any more complaints or concerns from the neighbors. The letter ended with a cold, formal reminder that all homeowners within the vicinity are expected to maintain a level of respect for community standards, as if this was some sort of threat. I couldn't believe what I was reading. After everything that had transpired, the confrontation at my door, the clear evidence I had presented, the fact that I had proven them wrong, they still tried to twist the narrative to make it seem like I was the one in the wrong. They were trying to save face, to cover up their embarrassment, and they were doing it by shifting the blame away from themselves and onto a miscommunication. It was as though they couldn't stomach the idea of admitting they had overstepped, that they had wrongfully assumed control over my property. Instead of accepting responsibility, they decided to gaslight me. I felt the familiar burn of frustration rise in my chest. They thought that just because they had some semblance of authority, they could manipulate the truth to suit their needs. But I wasn't about to let them get away with this. The letter was a clear attempt to undermine the fact that I had already proven my point, to muddy the waters and make it seem like I was the one causing trouble. It wasn't enough that they had been wrong. Now, they were trying to spin the story in a way that would make it look like I was the one resisting their reasonable requests. I was furious. But more than that, I was determined to not let them rewrite history. I decided that it was time to take a stand once again. This time, I would respond in a way that would leave no room for interpretation. I wasn't going to let them have the last word. I took out a piece of paper and began drafting my response, carefully choosing my words so that there could be no doubt about where I stood. In my letter, I made it clear that I had not only provided proof of my property's boundaries, but I had also done so with the full understanding that my land was not under their control. I reiterated the documents I had presented: the title deed, the land survey, and the official property map, all of which proved my case beyond a shadow of a doubt. I reminded them that their officers had visited my property without cause, making assumptions based on misinformation. There was no room for miscommunication. I had shown them the truth, and they could no longer deny it. I also pointed out that the HOA had no right to continue to monitor my property, as they had no legitimate claim over it. If they wanted to continue harassing me, I would not hesitate to take legal action. I made it clear that I would not tolerate any more attempts to interfere with my rights, and I would consider it a violation of my privacy and personal space. The tone of my letter was calm but firm, not letting any hint of doubt slip through. I wanted to make sure they understood that I was not just some homeowner they could push around. I was a person with rights, and I would stand up for those rights, no matter what. Once the letter was ready, I sent it off, certified, ensuring that it would be received and that they would have to acknowledge it. I wasn't going to let them twist the narrative again. This time, I was making my position clear, in writing, and there would be no turning back. In the days that followed, I waited anxiously to hear back. I knew that they would probably try to spin the situation once again, perhaps through another letter or another visit. But this time, I was ready. I was no longer intimidated. The truth was on my side, and I had done everything I could to protect my property and my rights. And yet, the silence stretched on. No response came. No follow-up visits. No further letters. It was as though the HOA had suddenly disappeared. I couldn't quite understand why they hadn't retaliated, hadn't tried to push back. Perhaps they realized they had gone too far, or perhaps they were hoping I would forget about the whole ordeal. But I wasn't going to let it go. I knew that the HOA was capable of dragging things out, using their resources to make life difficult for anyone who stood up to them. They might have backed off for now, but I knew that I had to remain vigilant. This was only the beginning. It wasn't until weeks later that I received another communication from the HOA. This time, it was a simple acknowledgement of my letter. A vague, Formal response that seemed to say very little. They apologized for the inconvenience caused and assured me that they would respect my property rights moving forward. The letter was non-committal, a final attempt at appeasing me without admitting any fault. But I wasn't fooled. The damage had been done. They had tried to manipulate the situation, and they had failed. I had proven that they were wrong, and now they had been forced to back down. I knew that, for the time being, I had won. The HOA had learned a lesson, and so had I. No matter how much they tried to twist the truth or rewrite the narrative, I had stood firm, and that was something I could be proud of. But I also knew that I had to stay vigilant. This wasn't the end. The HOA might have been forced to accept defeat for now, but they were always lurking in the background, waiting for the next opportunity to assert their control. I wouldn't let my guard down. I couldn't afford to. I had stood up to them once, and I would do it again if necessary. This was my property, and I would defend it no matter what. As the weeks passed after the HOA's retreat, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. I had won. That much was clear. I had proven that my property wasn't within their jurisdiction, and I had made sure to solidify my position with legal documentation that left no room for doubt. The officers had retreated in the face of my firm response, and their attempts to manipulate the situation and twist the truth had failed. They were forced to acknowledge that I was right, but that didn't mean they were done. I knew that organizations like the HOA didn't simply give up. They thrived on control, on asserting their power over others, and I couldn't ignore the fact that I had just stood up to their overreach. I had taken every step to protect my rights, to ensure that they wouldn't come back with renewed vigor or try to harass me again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The HOA wasn't just going to roll over because I had sent a letter or proven that my land was outside their jurisdiction. They had been caught off guard once, but they were nothing if not persistent. It was only a matter of time before they made another attempt to get involved in my life and my property. I couldn't afford to let my guard down. I spent the following days on edge, constantly scanning my property for any signs of intrusion. I double-checked the security cameras I had set up, ensuring they were properly working, and I even made sure to review the documents I had used to assert my rights just in case they came back with some new tactic. I had learned quickly that when it came to the HOA, nothing was ever as straightforward as it seemed. They had a history of using underhanded tactics, of quietly trying to assert their control in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious. I had to be ready for anything. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I received the letter I had been expecting. This time, there was no attempt at manipulation. There were no vague apologies or feigned gestures of goodwill. The letter was straightforward, brief, and surprisingly formal. The HOA acknowledged that they had made a mistake in attempting to inspect my property without cause, and they offered a formal apology for any inconvenience caused. The tone of the letter was entirely different from the previous one. Gone was the air of superiority, the thinly veiled threats. This letter was conciliatory, almost meek in comparison. The HOA also took the opportunity to clarify their stance going forward, stating that they respected my property rights and would no longer pursue any action regarding my land. There was a brief mention of monitoring future developments, but this time, it was not framed as a threat. Instead, it was presented as a general statement about their usual practices, almost as if they were trying to put the incident behind them without further escalation. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I read through the letter. They had backed down. I had stood firm, and now they were acknowledging that I had been right all along. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple win. It wasn't just a matter of proving my legal standing and watching them back away. No, this was about something bigger. This was about asserting my autonomy, my right to live my life free from the interference of an organization that had no business in my affairs. It was about making a statement that I wasn't going to let anyone take control of my property, no matter how much they tried to manipulate the situation or twist the facts. For days after receiving the letter, I found myself replaying the entire experience in my mind, how they had shown up at my door, demanding access to my property with no legal basis, How I had calmly stood my ground and refused to let them push me around. How I had gathered the necessary evidence to prove my case and sent them away. It was a strange feeling, looking back on it all. On one hand, I was relieved. I had won, and the threat of further intrusion had been eliminated. But on the other hand, I felt a lingering anger at how far the HOA had been willing to go, at how easily they had tried to assert control over my life without cause. In the weeks that followed, the HOA became a distant memory, fading into the background of my daily life. I kept an eye on the property, as I always did, but the sense of tension had faded. They had respected my rights and moved on, and I had no reason to believe they would return. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly at peace in my own home. But then, one morning, something unexpected happened. As I was getting ready for the day, I received a phone call from a local news station. They had caught wind of the situation and wanted to know more. Apparently, someone in the community had heard about my confrontation with the HOA and had passed it along to a reporter. The story had spread like wildfire, and now I was being asked to share my side of the story for a segment they were planning to air. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want to make a spectacle of the situation or invite any more attention to myself. But then I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about making sure others knew that they didn't have to accept being bullied by organizations like the HOA. I wasn't just an individual fighting back, I was part of a larger movement. I wasn't the only one who had experienced the overreach of an HOA. And I wouldn't be the last. But by sharing my story, I could help others understand that they had a right to stand up for themselves, that they didn't have to give in to the pressure. So, I agreed to the interview. When the camera crew arrived at my home, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I was no longer just defending my property, I was standing up for every homeowner who had ever felt oppressed by an HOA or any other organization that sought to control their lives. I shared my experience, explaining how the HOA had attempted to overstep their boundaries and how I had fought back, using the law to protect my rights. I wasn't angry anymore, but I was resolute. I wasn't going to let this go unnoticed, and I wasn't going to let anyone else feel powerless in the face of such an invasion. When the segment aired, I was flooded with messages from people across the community, some of whom had gone through similar experiences. They thanked me for speaking up, for showing them that they didn't have to accept the overreach of the HOA or any other organization that tried to infringe on their rights. It was a humbling moment, realizing that my actions had inspired others to take a stand in their own lives. Looking back, I realized just how much I had grown throughout this experience. I had started as a person who was simply trying to protect her property from the intrusion of an overzealous HOA. But by the end of it, I had become something more. I had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what was right, no matter how hard the fight. And in the end, I had won not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt oppressed, manipulated, or silenced. The HOA had learned their lesson. They realized that I wasn't someone they could intimidate or control. And I, too, had learned something valuable. That standing up for what's right, even when it feels like an uphill battle, is always worth it in the end. The final stand was not just about proving my point. It was about protecting my right to live freely, without fear of harassment, and helping others do the same. And in that, I had found something far more powerful than a simple victory. I had found peace. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories and tips on standing up for your rights.